The first hard cold of the year came down on Cheyenne, Wyoming the week before Thanksgiving, the kind that turns the morning air to glass and keeps the breakfast crowd lingering over coffee they don't need. Staff Sergeant Owen Brandt had stopped at a diner off Lincoln Way he'd never been to before, only because the interstate was closed for ice north of town, and he had time he hadn't planned on. At the end of the booth, Tess went still under the table. Her head came up, and she turned it toward the front of the room, toward a voice that had gone sharp. 2 tables over, a young manager was standing over an old man in a frayed field coat, telling him he needed to leave, that this wasn't a place to sit for free, and the old man was already gathering himself up with the slow, careful dignity of someone who has been asked to leave places before and has learned not to argue. What Owen Brandt did in the next 10 seconds, and what he learned over the following 4 days about the man in the field coat, would turn a small humiliation in a roadside diner into something the whole town would end up talking about. If this is the kind of story you stay for, subscribe and stay with me through what happened after he stood up. Owen had joined the Marines at 19, the son of a Wyoming ranch hand who had never had much and had never once made his son feel the lack of it. And Owen had carried his father's particular code into the Corps without ever needing it spelled out. You don't take more than your share. You don't look down on a man for his boots. And you stand up when standing up is called for. He served 14 years, infantry and then a long stretch as a combat instructor, and came home to Wyoming in 2021 with a hearing aid, a shoulder that argued with the cold, and the quiet that follows men back from the places the Corps sends them. He worked now as a welder and iron worker on the crews that put up grain structures and bridges across the high plains, solitary work in big weather that suited the shape of him. He drove Tess everywhere. She had come to him through a program that paired retired military working dogs with veterans, and the 2 of them had recognized something in each other in the first hour that neither had found easy to come by since coming home. Tess was a 7-year-old Belgian Malinois, sable going gray at the muzzle, lean and economical, with one ear that stood and one that had been torn in her working years and healed at a permanent half-mast. She had done real work before Owen got her, the kind that left her calm in chaos and watchful in calm, and she carried it lightly, the way the genuinely capable do. When Owen surfaced out of a bad night, gasping at nothing, Tess was already pressed along the length of his side, steady, breathing slow, her weight an anchor that pulled the room back to true. She made her judgments fast and held them. And Owen had learned that when Tess went still and turned her head, it was worth turning his own. The man in the field coat was named Walt Hendry. He was 81 years old. He had lived in Laramie County most of his life, and for 34 years he had been a brand inspector for the state of Wyoming, the man who stood in the cold at sale barns and loading chutes, verifying that the cattle changing hands belonged to the people selling them. A job that ran on a handshake reputation for being incorruptible, and Walt Hendry's had been exactly that for 3.5 decades. He had served in the Army in the early 1960s, stationed in Germany during the years the wall went up, and he had come home and married a woman named Ruthie and worked his inspections and raised 2 sons on the kind of living that never left much over, but always left enough. Ruthie had died in 2015. One of his sons had died in a highway accident in 2009. The other had moved to Oregon, and the calls had thinned to holidays, and then to nothing in particular. Walt had stayed in the small house outside town until 2 years ago, when a fall and a hard winter had made it impossible. And he had moved into a residential hotel near downtown Cheyenne that took his Social Security and gave him a room and not much else. He had no car anymore. He walked. On the cold mornings he walked to the diner off Lincoln Way because it was warm and because the waitress on the early shift, a woman named Carla, had been kind to him, and he nursed a single cup of coffee and a piece of toast, and he was not. Whatever the young manager believed, sitting there for free, he paid for what he took. Every time, an exact change counted out of a coin purse. And he left a tip he could not really afford, because his father had taught him the same thing Owens had. The reason he gathered himself up without arguing, the reason he did not say "I paid" or "I served" or "I have inspected more cattle than you have ever seen," was that Walt Hendry had reached the age and the circumstance where a man stops expecting to be believed and starts simply trying to leave a room with as little fuss as the room will allow him. His dignity had narrowed to that, not to being treated well, but to not being made into a scene. He would have walked out into the glass cold morning rather than insist on his own decency. The booth Owen was in put his back to the front of the room, but Tess had turned her head, and so Owen turned his. Have you ever watched someone be made small in public and felt the whole room decide, all at once, not to be the one to say anything? If you've been the person who finally said something or wished you had, tell me in the comments. I read every one. Owen stood up. He did not say anything. He left his coffee on the table and crossed the room, and Tess came out from under the booth and walked at his knee, and the room registered him the way rooms register a large, quiet man and a scarred working dog moving with purpose, the clatter of forks easing off, the conversations dropping a register. He stopped beside Walt Hendry, who had one arm into his field coat and a confused, braced expression, and Owen did not address the manager at all. He looked at Walt and said, "You eaten yet?" Walt blinked at him. "I was just going." "Sit down," Owen said, gently, and to the manager, still without heat, "He's with me. Bring him whatever he wants. I've got it." The manager, a young man named Brett, 26, who had been promoted 3 weeks earlier and was running on the specific anxious authority of someone who believes that being firm and being right are the same thing, started to say something about policy, about people who come in and sit, and Tess, who had been standing easy at Owen's knee, turned her head toward Brett and went still in a way that was not a threat, and was somehow more than a threat. The stillness of an animal that has assessed a situation completely. Brett stopped talking. He looked at the dog, and at Owen, and at the half-dozen tables that had gone quiet and were now unmistakably watching him. He said the food would be right out, and he went back behind the counter, and the morning resumed at a lower volume. Owen sat down across from Walt. Carla, the waitress, brought Walt a full breakfast and would not meet Owen's eye because hers were wet. And she squeezed Walt's shoulder once on her way past, in a way that told Owen this was not the first morning Brett had done this, only the first that had gone differently. Over that breakfast, and over the next several mornings, because Owen found himself stranded in Cheyenne by the ice, and then found reasons to stay stranded, the surface of the thing turned out to have more underneath it. Walt Hendry was not merely an old man being treated unkindly by a green manager. Walt was being treated unkindly by a green manager because Walt looked like a man it was safe to treat unkindly. The frayed coat, the careful coins, the residential hotel, and that surface was itself the product of something. Walt had been getting by on his Social Security and a small state pension. And the small state pension, he mentioned in passing, had been getting smaller, and he didn't quite understand it, and the man at the hotel who helped the residents with their mail and their checks had explained that there were fees now, processing fees, and Walt had let it go, because he was 81, and the man at the hotel handled the residents' business, and what was Walt going to do about it? Tess, lying under the diner table on the third morning, lifted her head and looked toward the door before the bell over it had finished ringing, and the man who came in was not anyone to Owen, but Walt's hand tightened around his coffee cup, and Owen filed it away. The man was middle-aged, soft, pleasant, and he nodded at Walt across the room with the easy familiarity of someone who has a hold on a person and knows it. And Walt nodded back the way you nod at a thing you cannot avoid. He did not come over. He bought a coffee to go and left. But Tess had not lain back down until he was gone, and Owen had learned to trust the things that kept Tess sitting up. What cracked Walt's reserve was not a question. It was Owen, on the fourth morning, mentioning his own father, the ranch hand who'd had nothing and given his son a coat instead, and Walt, quiet for a while, saying that his own father had been a brand inspector before him, and that he had taken the job to carry the name on, and that the whole of it, the 34 years of standing in the cold being the one man at the sale barn whose word could not be bought, had come down to this: a coin purse, a residential hotel, a young man telling him to leave a diner. He said it without self-pity. He said it the way a man reads a tally he has already checked twice. Then he said the thing he had not meant to say, which was that the man from the hotel had asked him last week to sign a paper making it easier to manage his accounts, and that Walt had signed it because he was tired, and that he had not read it, and that he had a bad feeling he could not afford to have. Owen thought about a sergeant from his second deployment, a man named Cody Reyes from Rollins, who had come home before Owen and fallen through every crack the country had to offer, and died in a motel of the kind of slow neglect that never makes the news, alone, with no one to stand up in any room on his behalf. Owen had not been there for Cody. He had been thinking about Cody for 9 years. He looked at Walt Hendry and the unread paper and the coin purse, and he did the arithmetic the way Walt's whole life had taught Walt to do it, and he stopped pretending the ice was the reason he was still in Cheyenne. The urgency was small and specific. Walt mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the man from the hotel, his name was Dale Mercer, and he held a position the hotel called Resident Services Coordinator, was taking several of the residents to the bank on Friday to get their accounts squared away before the holiday. It was Wednesday. Owen did not know exactly what getting squared away meant, but he knew the shape of it, and he knew it was the kind of errand that did not improve the accounts of 81-year-old men in frayed coats. Owen made calls. He called Adult Protective Services for Laramie County and filed a report with the flat specificity of a man who had written reports that mattered. He called a legal aid attorney in Cheyenne named Francis Ovitt, who heard the words Resident Services Coordinator and processing fees and paper he didn't read, and went quiet in the way of someone recognizing a pattern, and who said she could get a temporary freeze on any account changes if she could see the paper Walt had signed, and could be at the hotel Thursday. And he called the Wyoming Brand Inspector's office, on a hunch, and asked whether anyone there remembered a Walt Hendry, and the man who answered was quiet a moment and then said, "Walt Hendry trained half this office. Is he all right?" And Owen said not yet, but he was going to be, and asked if a couple of them might want to come by a diner on Lincoln Way on Friday morning. On Thursday, Francis Ovitt read the paper Walt had signed. It was a power of attorney, broad and open-ended, granting Dale Mercer authority over Walt's accounts, and over the accounts, she would learn, of 4 other residents who had signed similar papers, all coordinated by the same helpful man who handled the residents' mail. The processing fees had a destination. The Friday trip to the bank was the next step. Francis filed for an emergency freeze Thursday afternoon, and it was granted Thursday evening, and the bank flagged the accounts, and Dale Mercer's helpful arrangement, 18 months in the building, came apart in the space of a day because someone had finally stood up. Dale Mercer came to the diner on Lincoln Way on Friday morning. He had not come to confront anyone. He had come because Walt had his morning routine, and Dale was, as ever, keeping an eye on his residents, and because the bank had called him Thursday night, and he did not yet fully understand what was wrong, but understood that something was. And he came to the diner, with the soft, pleasant manner of a man who manages problems before they grow. To talk to Walt. To smooth the thing over. To be reasonable. He came in out of the cold with his easy nod ready. The diner was fuller than usual. Owen was in the booth. Walt was across from him with a full breakfast. Francis Ovitz sat at the counter with a folder. Two men in their 60s in canvas brand inspector jackets sat at a nearby table, drinking coffee they'd been nursing for an hour. Carla, the waitress, was watching from behind the register. And Brett, the manager, who had spent the week watching the large, quiet man and the scarred dog come in every morning, and had heard, in the way things travel through a small staff, why, stood very still behind the counter. Tess came out from under the booth before Dale Mercer was fully through the door. She did not bark. She crossed the floor and placed herself between Dale and the booth where Walt sat, and the sound that came from her was low and unbroken, and her torn ear and her standing ear were both forward, and her gray muzzle was level, and her eyes were on Dale Mercer, and did not leave him. When he took a step toward Walt's table, Tess took a step forward, into the aisle, and Dale Mercer stopped where he stood. He recovered. He looked at the room and assembled his pleasant face, and said he just wanted a word with Walt. That there seemed to be some confusion about the accounts. That he'd been helping Walt and several of the residents manage their finances as a courtesy. That everything had been above board, and he was happy to clear up any misunderstanding. He said the word courtesy, and he said the word misunderstanding, with the practiced ease of a man who had used both many times and never been contradicted in a room. The diner was quiet. The coffee machine hissed. Francis Ovitz's hand rested on her folder. And then Walt Hendry set down his fork and said, "I never read what you put in front of me. But I'm reading it now." 11 words, longer than the form usually runs, but Walt Hendry had spent 34 years being the man whose word was final, and the words came out in that voice, the brand inspector's voice, level and unhurried and absolutely certain. The voice of a man who had verified 10,000 transactions and had just verified one more. He was looking straight at Dale Mercer. He was not confused, and he was not afraid, and he was not leaving. The pleasant face came apart. Dale Mercer looked at the lawyer at the counter, and the folder under her hand, and the two brand inspectors who had stood up from their table without a word, and the room full of strangers who had all, at once, decided to be witnesses. Owen stood. He did not raise his voice. He said there was a lawyer present with the document Dale had asked Walt to sign, that the accounts of 5 residents had been frozen Thursday evening, that Adult Protective Services had an open report, and that the only misunderstanding in the room was Dale Mercer's, if he had believed this was going to keep working. He did not accuse. He laid the facts down one at a time, the way Walt had laid down coins, and let them sit on the table where everyone could count them. Dale Mercer left. Tess watched him through the front window all the way to his car and did not lie back down until he had pulled out of the lot. Walt Hendry sat in the booth with his breakfast, and his 2 old colleagues came and sat with him, and one of them said, "Walt, you trained me in 1986 and you scared the hell out of me." And Walt almost smiled. In the weeks that followed, the frozen accounts told the story to the dollar. Dale Mercer's arrangement with the residential hotel ended, and the matter moved into the county attorney's hands, and the money that could be recovered was recovered. The 4 other residents Dale had coordinated were found and made whole as much as the law allowed. The hotel changed how it handled its residents' mail, under some pressure. And Walt Hendry's small state pension came back to its right size, the fees that had been quietly skimming it gone. Brett, the manager, 26 and 3 weeks into a job he had not known how to do, came out from behind the counter one of those mornings and stood at Walt's booth and said he was sorry. that he hadn't understood, and Walt, who had spent a life being the man whose judgment was trusted and had no use for holding a grudge against a young one still learning, told him to sit down a minute, and told him a thing or two about the people who walk into a room looking like they don't matter, and Brett listened. And after that there was always a cup of coffee for Walt Hendry at the diner off Lincoln Way, and never again a question of whether he belonged there. Owen Brandt got unstranded when the interstate reopened, but he kept coming through Cheyenne. He'd drive in on a Saturday and have breakfast with Walt, and the two of them would talk about cattle and weather and Germany in the early 60s, and Tess would lie under the table with her chin on Walt's boot, and Walt got in the habit of saving her a corner of bacon, which Owen pretended not to allow. There are people the world has decided are safe to overlook, by their coat, their coins, the place they sleep, and the overlooking is its own kind of theft, the one that makes all the others possible. Walt Hendry had been a man whose word could not be bought for 34 years, and it had taken a stranger standing up in a diner to remind a room full of people, including Walt, that this was still true. Owen Brandt did not give Walt his dignity back. Walt had never lost it. Owen just stood up, in a room where everyone else had decided not to, and made the room remember it was there. He had the same cold morning as anyone else. The interstate was closed. Tess turned her head. So he stood up. That was the whole of it. It usually is. This story is for everyone who has ever been judged by the wear on their coat instead of the worth of their life, and for everyone who has watched it happen and found the nerve to stand up. The standing up is small. It changes everything. Is there a Walt in your life? Someone the world has decided to overlook? Who deserves to have someone stand up in the room? Tell me about them in the comments. I read every one. Let's fill this section with names that were never safe to overlook. Every story on this channel is about standing up when the room goes quiet. If that means something to you, subscribe so you're here for the next one. There are more stories to tell. Which moment in this story stayed with you? I'll see you in the comments.